Well, Maxwell, thank you very much. And ladies and gentlemen, thank you all for coming. It's great to be back at the ASI. It's been a long time since I did one of these. And I can't help noticing that the Adam Smith Institute is changing, evolving. She may be struggling with a transition, and Putin may be struggling with a transition, but the Adam Smith Institute, rather remarkably, is outliving its founders and managing to pass on authority to the next generation, which is no small thing. So congratulations, and thank you for asking me. In this, the 300th year, the tricentenary of the birth of the Sage of Kirkcaldy. It's a great honour to be here in this special year. We know very little about the early life of Adam Smith. Almost the only story that we have is that when he was very small, he was kidnapped by a gang of gypsies. And a passing traveller heard the piteous wails coming from one of the wagons, alerted the townspeople, and a mounted posse was dispatched and rescued him. Unsurprisingly, perhaps after that, he turned into a very timid man, lived with his mother, never married. But I've often wondered whether the originality of his thought may stem from the idea that they got the wrong baby. And that somebody was, if you like, brilliant at looking at society from the outside because they'd come from somewhere very different. And I just have this wonderful fantasy that there was in some traveller's encampment in the east of Scotland a prim young boy growing up saying, "Father, I wish to become a professor of philosophy." "Yerny, son of mine! I wish to study at Oxford." "You gave a house!" We will never know. But it is wonderful to be here. Okay, I wanted to talk about why things are going wrong. And I want to illustrate this with a recollection that happened to me quite recently. Now, many of you will have had the experience, as I've had quite a lot recently, of being stuck in an airport. Things have not returned to how they were pre-lockdown. Delayed flights are a big deal. And I was stuck for a very long time, waiting for a repeatedly delayed flight, and listening to the comments of the stranded travellers around me. Almost without exception, they blamed the airline. One or two people said, "Well, actually, this airport has been crap for a while." But not a single one thought to blame the politicians or protesters who had prevented the extra runway being built there. Now, ladies and gentlemen, I invite you to ponder how those incentives align for the elected representatives who have to make these decisions. You can take the unpopular decision of building the runway, or the reservoir, or the housing estate, or the nuclear power station, or whatever it is, but you are never going to be thanked by a later generation saying, "Oh, the lights are still on," or "Oh, the flights are working on time." Right? People are failing to link action and consequence. You might say the defining characteristic of maturity, right? The thing that stops you being a child is what the Eden story was about. It's when you begin to recognize a sense of responsibility and therefore morality because you understand that what you do has consequences. I think as an electorate, we've lost that, or are losing it at any rate. And we're therefore giving the people we elect a series of perverse incentives. I happen to give the example of the airport, but you can all think of dozens of others. Yes, we've got to be green. Yes, bring over Greta Thunberg, she's wonderful. Why is my energy bill going up? Yeah, we absolutely must support Ukraine, struggle for democracy, evil. Why am I having to pay more? Right? And if people are unable to make these connections, they will make bad choices because, as infants do, they will blame the authority figures rather than trying to puzzle through why things have not worked out as they wish. And we get this over and over again. So people will say, for example, I can't afford, young people can't afford a house, and at the same time we've got to preserve these beautiful green fields. Now, rather than then saying, okay, it's a trade-off, right? You're never going to be 100% happy, but the art of politics is finding the point on that spectrum where you cause minimum disquiet and dissatisfaction. 90% of people fall back into saying, the reason we have not got the outcome I wanted is because we're governed by bad people. And if only we were governed by good people, then this wouldn't happen. It is the ultimate kind of infant cry. my favourite example of this, because it is the one that is the most destructive in its consequences, is that, we forget this, but over 90% of people backed the first lockdown, over 80% backed the second lockdown, 78% didn't want the restrictions lifted, and yet the people who were loudest in demanding the longest and strictest set of prohibitions are now the ones complaining about the inflationary consequences. And in the forefront, of course, are the public sector unions. The people who created the inflation by insisting that we pay people to stay at home and printing money to cover the difference are now demanding that we rescue them with yet more intervention from the consequences of the policy that they enforced on the country. Right? Now, unless people are able to join the dots, this is going to keep happening whichever party is in power. So, what can we do about it? Well, one of the classic things that people then say is, well, shouldn't we have some basic economics in schools? Shouldn't it be a core part of what we do? Now, we need to be very careful about enforced school curriculums, because whatever the curriculum says, it will be in the hands, interpreted by and acted on the coalface by people who are not sympathetic with the majority of those of you in this room. I can remember, I'm old enough to remember when, under the Thatcher governments, Ken Baker decided that people needed to have some history as part of what made them a British citizen, and so that was introduced. He drew up this curriculum, and of course the requirement for history then became a way for teachers to portray the whole of our history as an infamous chronicle of racism and exploitation and slavery, which, to put it as neutrally as I can, is neither accurate nor close to the views of the people who had the idea of doing it in the first place. So we want to be careful with saying economics is necessary, lest all our young people then be taught modern monetary theory and various other bizarre socialist heresies. However, I think there are one or two things, one or two features of economics on which pretty much everyone agrees. And if they were more familiar to the public, not only would people be better voters and more active and engaged citizens, but they would make better life decisions themselves. So almost every economist, left, right, or mid, or centre, would agree, would at least recognise the concept of opportunity costs. Right? If you're spending this amount of money on the NHS, you don't have it to spend on something else. That is almost completely missing from our public discourse. And I don't just mean in the obvious sense of monetary substitution. Right? When people say, let's have this regulation to protect workers, or let's have this regulation to make the air cleaner, or whatever, there is almost no discussion of the costs of doing that, whether in terms of direct money elsewhere or in terms of less freedom to do things. So a little bit of that would help. There are, I think, let me at this point quote Brian Kaplan, who wrote a book about this. There are three things that he recognised as being common to almost all economists, but widely misunderstood by the public. And if these things were on our curriculum, I think we would be better citizens and happier individuals. The first is what he calls the price fallacy. Most people think that prices are determined by what the seller feels like charging. Hence all the conversations we're having at the moment about greedflation. Right? It's one of those bizarre things. Prices go up of energy, water, whatever it is, and people say, oh, it's the greedy producer, greedy oil companies, greedy supermarkets. When prices fall, they never make the corollary of saying, oh, how generous of them. They must be doing this out of the kindness of their heart. Right? But it's a fairly simple lesson to explain to people that prices are not intrinsic, right? And that therefore, if you're selling something more expensively than someone else, it's not because you're gouging, it's not because you're profiteering, it's because price varies according to circumstance. And if every school leaver understood that, I think we'd be better off. He talks also, Brian Kaplan, of what he calls the anti-foreign bias. Most people are intrinsically xenophobic when it comes to imports. Almost everyone thinks that it is a problem if you have a big trade deficit. Almost everyone thinks that it is dangerous to trade too much with countries that have very low wages. Almost everyone thinks that we should protect strategic industries. Almost everyone is alarmed when they discover that we import 42% of the food we eat. And yet, Adam Smith anticipated and brilliantly answered all of those objections 250 years ago. All of those instincts, all of those intuitions that lead us in a mercantilist or protectionist direction, when turned into policy, make us poorer. That isn't some Austrian economics thing. I think almost every economist would agree with that. And then finally, I always think this is the toughest one in politics. It's what Kaplan calls the make-work bias. People persist in seeing jobs as a benefit rather than as a cost, or more precisely, they persist in seeing jobs as a benefit rather than as a means to the end of greater prosperity, which is the real benefit that we want. Right? So I have this argument all the time in the Trade Department. Whenever we strike a trade deal with someone, I say, well, can't we explain how it means that things will be cheaper? And they say, no, people don't like exports, but we'll talk about all the extra jobs we're creating. Well, first of all, in politics, that's just politicians, blah, 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 right? We've created X number of jobs. Nobody's listening. But second, why is that seen as a good thing, right? If you abolished diggers, right? I declare my interest. I work sometimes for JCB. If you abolished all diggers and you had lines of men with shovels, you'd be creating jobs, yeah? But I hope we can all see that you'd be making everybody a bit poorer. And in a world where technology is accelerating, where we're all moving into much more of a gig economy, where probably none of you will have a job as we understood that word in the 20th century, where you're going to go through your lives freelancing and constantly reskilling and adapting to changes in tech and to AI and so on. The goal is for you to live as well as possible, and if you can do that working shorter hours, great. It frees up more time to do another job if you really want, right? But the idea of creating work as a good thing in itself is not, and I think every economist would accept this, it's a burden, it's not a benefit. Now, could we in some way shoehorn these ideas into our schools or into our universities with some difficulty? You know, I mean, we haven't done it yet, despite having had a Conservative-led government for 13 years. And, like I say, you're dealing with a standing bureaucracy that is pretty hostile. However, there are organisations, such as the Adam Smith Institute, that can reach over the heads of some of the blobs and convince people directly. And that's your job. And when I say your job, I mean all of you in this room. I don't just mean the ones who are working for ASI or interning here or whatever, right? All of us can play a part in disseminating these ideas. They are counterintuitive ideas, in the exact sense of that word. They run up against instincts and intuitions that worked very well for us on the savannas of Pleistocene Africa, but that are not well adapted to the modern world. Whenever you address the issue of free market economics to somebody who's unfamiliar with the subject, you are dealing with someone who is going to lead with his caveman instincts. But I've got to have a stash of food to see me through the winter, right? And you've got to explain patiently and politely why that is inapt to our present prosperity. But I tell you what, my friends, if you guys are not doing this, no one else is going to do it for you. And that's the responsibility that you have. And so, in this tercentenary year of the birth of the greatest moral philosopher and the greatest economist, do your bit to keep those difficult but sublime ideas alive. Ensure that in 300 years' time, we've made this country the great free trading success that it became when we followed Adam Smith's recipes. It was what lifted us above the run of nations. It's what made us the richest place on the planet for a long time, before others copied us, which was great, right? Good for them and good for us. Right? So all of you now have that same responsibility to recognize how lucky we have been to have inherited these ideas from previous generations and now to pass them on intact to future ones.